We're joined by James Sunderland, Conservative MP for Bracknell, and also a military veteran of 26 years, having left only 3 years ago. Thanks very much for coming on, Mr. Sunderland. Or I don't know which aspect of this you want to tackle. We can talk about sponsorship and sport, if you like, or maybe militarily, what you suppose can be done to help a country which is on the brink of falling anyway, by the look of it.
Well, hello, Adrian. Thank you for inviting me on. I think there's lots to talk about today. We could talk about sport, politics, the military, but clearly what we've seen over the last 24 hours is a pretty abhorrent action by Russia to invade an entirely sovereign country next door. And I therefore agree that it's absolutely right that the international community takes the full force of sanctions against Russia, because it's not the right thing to do.
Okay, but everybody's got to step in line or there'll be way round sanctions. I mean, to give an example, we've banned Aeroflot, and they've banned British Airways from their airspace. Now, I happen to have a friend who's in Moscow at the moment, got to get back, so they're coming, by Lufthansa, using an indirect flight. So because Germany isn't taking the same action as us, there'll be a way around the sanctions. So in which case the sanctions become an inconvenience rather than dramatically damaging.
Well, I agree to a certain extent. I mean, sanctions unilaterally don't really work, but if they are joined by the consensus of the Western world, if every Western nation bans Aeroflot and imposes the sanctions that we've seen yesterday by both the UK, the US and elsewhere, then life becomes pretty unpleasant for the Russians. And it's part of a layered strategy where we can ratchet up and ratchet down as required.
So militarily, what, if anything, would you like to see happen? I'm not clear what help we can give to the country once it's already fallen. Once, let's say, they take control of even just half the eastern half of Ukraine.
Well, I think the MOD has done a very good job so far. We've led the world diplomatically in terms of the response to the crisis. We've galvanised NATO, galvanised the EU, and James Heappey this morning in the chamber was very, very clear. Because Ukraine is not an Article 5 compliant country, we're not going to put boots on the ground, and we're not going to intervene directly.
By Article 5 compliance, you mean it's not a member of NATO, therefore NATO members aren't duty-bound to defend it?
Yeah, I mean, by being not Article 5 compliant, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, therefore there is no treaty obligation to defend Ukraine against aggressors. But of course we are involved. Of course you could argue what's next. Is this a pretext for something else? Could the conflict spread further west? Could it come into Poland? I mean, these are pretty serious questions that need to be answered. So I think it is absolutely right that the Western community, the Western world and NATO take a robust stance against Russia for that very reason.
So as somebody said earlier, there's a heavy line is being drawn around NATO's borders. So even if we the fact is we're going to let Ukraine go because we're not going to put troops on the ground or have a no-fly zone. So that means the border with Romania, Poland, where else going, right up towards the Baltic states. That's going to become a new Iron Curtain, isn't it?
Well, we had that yesterday from the president of Ukraine talking about the new Iron Curtain. What I would say to you, though, is that we're not going to let Ukraine go. That's really important. Of course, Ukraine has had lots of support from the British military and other nations over the last few years. We are supplying weapons rightly. We are giving advice rightly. And no doubt they're receiving lots of intelligence support as well.
But what if it falls? But I mean, the analysts I'm speaking to that we've heard from this morning are saying, a good part of it will probably have fallen by the end of the weekend. Now, if that's the case, what then? What help can we give once it's been taken and held?
Well, it's a very fair question, and these plans are no doubt being worked up now as we speak. But at this point in time, it's very important that Kiev does not fall. The Russian invasion has been pretty fierce, but it is being halted at certain parts of the country. I believe that the Russians have two vulnerabilities. Firstly, they're vulnerable in the air to the man-portable air defence weapons that the Ukrainians have got, and they're also vulnerable in terms of anti-armour. Ukraine has got some pretty potent anti-armour weapons. We've already seen, tragically, lots of Russian loss of life. And this is further to go, yeah. It's a very serious situation, and no doubt it will be very ugly.
So what do we do if we end up in a situation where Ukraine very soon looks like the old East and West Germany? Say the Russians hold the East, and then the West looks west towards NATO. I mean, wildly suboptimal, but is that something we'd end up having to work with?
Well, the whole thing's suboptimal. Again, the Russians have, without foundation, without justification, invaded a truly sovereign neighbour. So what this looks like in 6 months, I just don't know. But we have to hope that Putin yields to the pressure upon him, both militarily and politically, diplomatically. And of course, I don't think the Russians want to be there in the first place. These are conscripts. They are young men and women who don't want to be there. I don't believe their appetite for fighting their neighbours and cousins is particularly strong. The Ukrainians have pretty potent armed forces. Some are regular, some are reservist. So I think it's going to be quite bloody. And I just do not believe that Putin wants a protracted military conflict on his doorstep.
But, I don't blame you for this, because we've been doing the same thing. But we're talking as though it's possible Ukraine can still beat Russia back. And all the evidence is suggesting that's just not going to be possible. If they're going to take a big part of the country, and then it's a whole different game. It's incredible to say, but that's how it seems.
Well, you're not wrong, and what you portray is pretty grim, it's pretty scary, but at this point in time, we've got 200,000 Russian troops advancing across Ukraine, and they're advancing on the capital. If the capital falls, we're then in a situation where effectively Russia controls Ukraine. It becomes Russian territory in a military perspective. So we have to look at things as they evolve. We have to make the right plans, and we have to effectively reinforce our borders so that it does not spill across further west or south.
So you've been a soldier. What do you suppose your former comrades will be thinking now? I mean, I spoke to one yesterday who's retired. He said he'd love to be in Ukraine helping to train their soldiers and support them now. I mean, what would you have wanted to do if this was 10, 15 years ago when you were still fighting? You're still in the army.
Well, Adrian, there are 2.2 million veterans in the UK. I'm sure many of those would want to be there doing their bit for the country. This is a national imperative that we do support Ukraine as best we can within the bounds of what's been agreed this morning and this week in the Commons. I would hazard a guess that most of my colleagues think the same way that I do, that they have a duty, it's their responsibility. If the balloon goes up, it's their responsibility to go into arms and to bear arms and to do what they can for their neighbours. But at this point in time, armed forces have been prevented rightly from direct intervention. We have to see what happens next.
Briefly, Dominic Cummings has let fly last night. He said, "My disgust for Westminster is never higher than when it's excited about war." He said, "All the worst of its lies, posing, cant, bullshit, BS, idiocy, hypocrisy, moral cowardice, incompetence, operational uselessness get turned up to 11. Now, look, you've been in the army and you've been in the House of Commons. Can you reassure us that the latter is as competent as the former?"
Oh, what a great question. I mean, the first thing I'd say, of course, is Dominic Cummings has an axe to grind.
Yeah.
I think it's becoming increasingly marginalised now. I don't think anybody believes him. The pattern of behaviour there, which is not very healthy or helpful. What I would say to you is that I work for two institutions, and they are very different.
Yeah.
The armed forces is very, very professional. They will do their duty. Westminster, no less professional, but differences of opinion.
Okay.
And I think ultimately what you've got now is a great consensus.
Okay.
Look at the way that Labour, the opposition, are
Thank you very much.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
With the BBC News on 5 Live at 1 o'clock, I'm Stuart Clarkson. Invading Kiev. There have been reports of clashes there, with social media footage showing armoured vehicles in the Obolon district, as fierce fighting in other parts of the country, as well as the full-scale attack goes into its second day. Large numbers of Ukrainian